Okay. All right. I start off, and I don't normally do this, right? I'm always giving you ancient depictions of the ancient world. This is one called the School of Philosophy, and it is depicting sort of the all the classical philosophers. And people play a game about identifying individuals. The person lounging on the stairs there is generally considered to be Diogenes, who was the cynic, who lived an ostentatiously simple, scruffy life as part of his philosophical life. It's also sort of thought of that Plato and Aristotle are the two in the center, strolling so casually. And they do look like they're strolling casually. Anyway, just an interesting thing there. So, philosophy is very much one of the things that we identify with the ancient Greek world. In fact, when we think about what the ancient Greeks provided to us or passed down to us, philosophy might be the number one thing, even more than the Olympics or theater or wine drinking contests. It's philosophy. Interesting that it became such a huge exploding cultural phenomenon. And it goes back quite a ways. Up until the late 7th century, so we're talking 620s, the Greeks generally explained their world and the phenomenon around it by the gods. Zeus makes it rain, Demeter makes the crops grow, Artemis oversees the wild creatures in the world. A very quick wave and very large wave started up in where there was a desire to want to understand the world in different terms than just divine intervention. And it tended to be based on two things. It was based on observations. But there was a lot of math that got involved with that. So if you're not a math person, that's probably very disappointing to hear. There were two particular centers where this happened, and where you would get one person and then somebody else might be their student, but it seemed to build on itself so that you would have a community of people who had the same interest. And that's exactly what it takes to really get a movement going, because now you've got a number of people working off of each other, working off ideas, and it could be pottery techniques, right? It could be military skills. In this case, it's philosophy. And the one is in the east around Miletus and Samos, and the other is in the west. Ely and Croton are South Italy. And once it takes effect, then it becomes kind of self-perpetuating, right? Somebody gets a reputation for being oh, he's got some really interesting ideas. I want to go and talk to him and listen to him. A lot of the early first steps are really more about physiology. It's not creating overarching abstract concepts. It's really just about explaining the world. What's the world made of? The nature of matter actually was a big thing that was discussed. What is the basic substance of everything? And how is it arranged? And this is it. Once people started talking about what's everything made of, they kind of just focused on that topic and not much else. By the way, if you're interested in reading more about philosophy, particularly introductory stuff, you don't want to get into a massive rabbit hole, but you're just interested in reading a bit more about any one of the philosophers. Stanford has a really good It's almost like an online encyclopedia of philosophy, and you can look up anybody and everybody. So, to remind us how important Socrates is, since the ancient world, Greek philosophy is divided between everything that happened before Socrates and everything that happened after. And he's the line. Everyone before Socrates is called the pre-Socratics. They'd probably be kind of intrigued by the fact that they got that name, because not only does it sort of lump them into one category, but it lumps them into one category of someone that they never met and knew. Anyway, and there were some greats, people who were considered to be exceptional, just running through some of these names: Thales of Miletus, Anaximander of Miletus, Anaximenes of Miletus. Yeah, they always have fun names too, right? So you can see right away there's a little hotbed of philosophy just in Miletus. Anybody remember anybody remember us bumping into Miletus before now? Yeah.
Was Miletus the city that was sacked in the Persian Wars?
Yes, almost. Yes. Just before the Persian Wars. Miletus is the city that kind of triggered them, because, actually, let's do this. There we go. There's Miletus. They're the ones that attacked the Persian city of Sardis, got up the Persians' noses. They were attacked in return. Athens had gone over to help Miletus in all of this mischief that they were getting into. So, in terms of, so it's like, gee, that doesn't sound very philosophical. But it was before all that happened that this was going on. But it does suggest that this is a prominent city, a big enough city that they can actually go and attack a major capital of the Persian Empire and defeat them. So they've got a fair bit of population, wealth, probably more likely to have people who have the spare time to think about philosophy, because they don't have to spend all their time in the fields or harvesting grapes or olives or what have you. It also suggests that they're interacting at a fairly high, significant level and a deep level with the Persian Empire. So now they have access to ideas and thoughts from other places in the Persian Empire, like Egypt, like Mesopotamia. Anyway, Pythagoras of Samos, which is not very far away. Xenophanes of Colophon, basically a neighbor there. Heraclitus of Ephesus, right there. So it's a very small area that this is all happening in. Then we have Parmenides of Elia, Zeno of Elia, and we're here now in southern Italy. So it's a completely different group doing their thing, and doing their thing a little bit later, you notice. I've put these in, by the way, chronological order. Go back to Samos for Melissus of Samos. So they're like they're the big 9 pre-Socratic philosophers. Putting it into perspective, this is kind of around the time of Solon, particularly in the early stages. Solon, Sappho, Alcaeus. So there's a lot of intellectual activity going on. It's not just philosophy and nothing. It's philosophy, it's politics, it's lyric poetry. All kind of happening towards the end of the 600s and the first part of the 500s BCE. And this is like, well, let me think. We're a good 100 years before the Peloponnesian War. All right. I was just just remind us where Athens is. Anyway, as I say, it reminds us that the society, unlike Dark Ages Greece, where it's subsistence living, we've now reached a stage where there are enough people in a community that are sufficiently successful that they can do something other than just get by. So more non-essential pursuits get taken up. Anyway, so as I said, go with the flow. I've divided everybody up between before Socrates and after Socrates as well. So we'll start with six major pre-Socratic philosophers. The first one I have up is Thales of Miletus. He's credited with being the first natural philosopher, and he suggested that water was the single material substance. Everything around us is made of water. And this is generally how the great philosophers looked at it, was they'd look at all the various objects, all the various materials in the world around them. And they figured, okay, one of them actually must be the root of everything else. And so for Thales, it's water. And the logic very much runs like this. We've seen water in solid form, ice. We see it in liquid form, water. And we see it in gaseous form, steam. So we know that water can exist in a number of different forms. I'm just going to extend that principle and say that everything is made of water, and it's just different types of solid, different types of gas. The story about Thales was that somebody took a round out of him for saying, you know, you think you're clever, but you're not really clever. You don't make money out of this. Philosophy is like, it's a waste of time. So you can't really be that smart. And so, according to the story, Thales predicted, because of sort of being the first weather forecaster, that there was going to be a bumper crop of olives. And so, before that happened, in the spring, when the olive trees are just starting up, he went and he cornered the market on olive presses. And then, when there was this huge bumper crop, everybody needed to press their olives. And he could charge whatever he wanted to lease them out. And he made a bomb. That's how the story goes. And then he turned around to the guy and said, see, I can make a bunch of money anytime I want. It's not a priority. But I just did this to show you. Anyway, he developed, because I told you there's math involved, Thales' theorem, which is that if a triangle has 3 points on a circle and one of the sides is a diameter, the opposite angle has to be a right angle. Number 2. And by the way, of course, when we're this far back in history, this is before this is so long before you have the Parthenon and the great sculptors of the 5th century BC. So we don't tend to get contemporary representations of these individuals. They are typically either sculptures that somebody said, I think this guy looked like this, or I have heard tales from great-great-granddad that he looked like this. Or they just make something up that seems, I think that a person who thought like this probably looked like this. Sometimes we don't even have that. Anyway, Anaximander was a contemporary of Thales. He suggested that the single substance in the cosmos was just some unspecified boundless stuff. He's credited with inventing the sundial, and particularly the gnomon. The G being silent, at least for us. Now, we think of a sundial as something that lies flat, but here's a more three-dimensional version of a sundial. The gnomon, anybody guess? It's basically the rod that catches the sun's sorry, it doesn't catch the sun's rays. It creates the shadow that falls on the dial itself. So basically, it's like the hand of the clock. I'm kind of skeptical of this, but he was credited with developing this.
Does it only go one side?
I mean, you're not really need to tell time about it.
Yes, that's exactly right. You look at this, and you sort of, like I look at this, and the first time it's like, well, it's kind of interesting looking, but I can't see how it would work. But if the sun rises, here and goes across there, so sun's here, hits the gnomon, and it's that o'clock. And then the sun goes across, and then at the end of the day, it's there. So we're used to seeing a full circle for the clock, but you only have a half circle, like you say. Yeah. Because when the sun is here, there's no light. What with the Earth not being transparent. But you see, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, you can create a sundial that's like this, but even at that, it's only using the half. All right. Number 3, Anaximenes. You guys are probably just glad that I'm the one who has to pronounce the names. Anaximenes of Miletus. A little bit later. Contemporary or student of Anaximander, because he's about a generation behind. He suggested that the single material substance in the cosmos was air. By the way, for the Greeks, when they talk about the everything, they're not going to say universe, but they're not going to just say the world either. They tend to use the term cosmos, K-O-S-M-O-S. You spell it with a C now. For them, that was the entirety of existence, was the cosmos, which is the earth, the sky, the heavens, and the underworld. Anyway, so everything in the cosmos is made of air. And then he explains the difference in substance by whether it is really dense or whether it's quite, it's less dense. So we're sitting on chairs that are incredibly dense air. He taught the doctrine of change. And so you get this sequence of changes that fire turns to air, air turns to wind, wind to cloud, cloud to water. And you see, that actually makes total sense, right? Water to earth, and that's based on the fact that the rain falls down onto the earth, but it doesn't just make it doesn't turn into an enormous lake of water. Therefore, it must be turning into earth, and then earth condensed sufficiently becomes stone, and that's as dense as it gets.
Does it like go back to fire or start the cycle?
Yeah, they would have seen it going in the opposite direction as well, because this is it. You could break down stone, for instance, to get back to earth, or to get to
you can like strike stone to make fire, or would that?
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if you can skip a step. But certainly water evaporates back up to be cloud.
Yeah.
Anyway, part 4, Heraclitus. He's, again, you can see he's another generation along. in Ephesus, the leader of the Ephesian school. So at this point, Miletus is the hotbed of philosophy and has been now for a few decades. And Heraclitus starts attracting students and followers in Ephesus, which is not any great, just like down the road. He taught that life is a balance of opposing forces. And it's that balance that maintaining that balance is how things keep going. But having that opposing forces is what makes things happen. And he also, this is kind of a key one because a lot of other philosophers are going to pick up on this, that logos is the central core of being. I always have to stop when I leave the microphone. That's kind of a big one because philosophers after this are going to very much key on the importance of this term logos in ancient Greek. That it's basically just the word for word. As in, I am the word. That word is logos. But it also represents logic, reason, rationality. So the core of a person's existence or being, a human being's existence, is their rationality. By the way, just talking about terminology here, I should mention that it's surmised that one of the reasons why Greek particularly latched onto philosophy and why philosophy was so successful in the ancient Greek culture as compared to others is that Greek is very good at making up words. It's very easy to create new words using the Greek language. And there's no problem about taking roots and just putting them together like building blocks. So as a result, it is much easier in Greek than a lot of other languages to come up with the vocabulary for new concepts because you've got a language that can create new language or new vocabulary. As opposed to Latin, for instance, which is really bad at it. I don't know why. I mean, look at us. Like, I can't still figure out why. But just as an example, and of course the Greeks, like you see, this is like way before the Romans are around. When the Romans come around, they start bumping into Greeks. They start being influenced by all kinds of Greek culture, including philosophy. The Romans didn't even have a word for existence or being. They had to create it, and they weren't comfortable. You get the sense they weren't comfortable with doing it. I mean, it's not difficult. It's simply the present participle of the verb to be. Being. Like, that wasn't hard to do, but the Romans didn't ever use the present participle of the verb to be, so it didn't exist in the language. So stuff like that. It's also theorized why German philosophy became successful and became a major cultural event in German, because German is also a language that can easily make up words. Like, you can't look up all the words in a German dictionary because often they just shove stuff together. Okay, now we got a new word. So again, you can think up new concepts and then you can give them a name. All right, so we're going through the different substances. For Heraclitus, fire was the single material substance of which all things were made. And they used to have like these great debates. It's fire. No, it's water. No, it's air. He also, I wouldn't say he started, but he certainly made a bit of an art of slagging off his philosophical, he would call them opponents, but just people who had different ideas to him. He was not very charitable in his assessments, right? He was apt to think that, no, I know what I'm talking about. They're a bunch of idiots. Five out of six. Penultimate pre-Socratic philosopher of the day. Pythagoras. There's probably the first name that we really recognize, for good or for ill. Now, here's how things can develop. So he's born in Samos. He's born over at the east end of the Mediterranean, just off the coast of what's now Turkey's. In Asia Minor, he's not very far away from Ephesus and Miletus. But he moved to southern Italy, to Croton, and that's where he did most of his work. He not only expounded on philosophical themes, he was also very involved in local politics. And he was very much, well, he wasn't shy, put it that way. He was quite happy to stand up and say what he felt in loud and forceful terms, which meant that he attracted followers. So his contribution, and again, for all of these individuals, it's not that they necessarily invented this stuff themselves. We can't say for sure, but there's certainly the name that is attached to some given thought. We just go with that. So he talked a lot about how the soul is a little bit of divinity. Now that actually is something that the Greeks already imagined. The story of Heracles, for instance, becoming a god is the idea that although he lived his life as a mortal, and he was kind of treated as a mortal, because if he was immortal, then all of these death-defying feats are not very impressive. They're really more impressive. They're only really impressive if there is the thought that he could be killed. But he gets burnt, his mortal half burns away, and his divine bit goes up and becomes a god. So the notion that a mortal can carry around some divinity within them is very much a reasonable thought, reasonable idea for the ancient Greeks. But he extends it that there is a divine element in everything. And that it is very much entombed there. And here we get this concept of reincarnation, where the divine part of you, your soul, when you die, it gets reincarnated, and each step is a step towards your soul reaching a state of perfection. And when you reach that stage, then you stop. You don't need to be reincarnated anymore. Now, how you reach this stage of perfection isn't just experiencing life. It is through study, and it's studying philosophy. So you study philosophy, your soul gets closer to perfection, but also studying math as well. So that's the case. My soul has a long way to go. Anyway, and then as we know the Pythagorean theorem, the area of A plus the area of B equals the area of C, or A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Something like that. So this is it. If you extend the sides of a triangle into 3 squares, the squares of the two shorter sides, the area of those squares equals the area of the square of the longer side. There we go. We all don't have to thank me that I just took everybody one step closer to soul perfection. All right. Now we go to the Socratics, the big guys. Of course, Socrates, we bumped into him already. We have Plato, his student. The student, we tend to think the student of Plato as Aristotle. And then I've got a number of people underneath him. And that is because Aristotle set up a school. It's still hard to say exactly how official and organized it was, but it seems to have been sufficiently well organized that individuals who came afterwards were considered to be the head of that school. If you look at the dates, though, you can see that it gets a little fuzzy and higgledy-piggledy, particularly when you get down to Aristotle. And some of them we just don't have that much information on, or that writings. Of course, Aristotle wrote a ton, and most of it survives, and it was hugely influential for millennia, like well into the Middle Ages. Aristotle kind of ruled the world philosophically. Theophrastus, actually, we have some writings of his that survives. He was kind of more into psychology because he wrote something called the Characters, which was basically different behavioral types. He wrote it, it's called the Characters, so he's thinking in terms of creating characters for fiction, but it's like the meddlesome person, the bore, that kind of thing. And then we have Epicurus, then we kind of jump a bit. We have Epicurus, Zeno, and we'll talk a bit about both of those because they are hugely influential in the ancient world. And then I got to mention Archimedes. I don't know if anybody knows the story of Archimedes or what he discovered. Archimedes is the one who discovered the laws of displacement. Like when you put something in water and you plunk it in there and then the water displaces and moves. He supposedly came up to this while he was sitting in the bath. And then he jumped out of the bath, ran through the streets and said, "Eureka," which means I figured it out. I found it. There you go. That's what Eureka means. I found it. And I think we probably all heard some of that version of that story. I have to stop and think to myself, I don't think they had bathtubs in the ancient world. Like, I mean, Roman baths were communal. It was like a swimming pool. If you get into a swimming pool, you're not going to suddenly be, oh my God, look at this displacement I created. Yeah. So he must have had some sort of a private little sitz bath or something. Anyway, that unfortunately, see, that's the historian interrupting a good philosophical thought. Can't help myself. All right. So the Greek philosophers, again, I've got 6. So I suppose if you put them together, it's like an Olympic group of 12 philosophers. Didn't do that on purpose, just happened that way. We've chatted about Socrates, and we're going to talk, and I hope we're going to talk about him and some of his thoughts more deeply. By contemporary standards, he was not handsome. There's quite a few depictions of Socrates, and we have a description of him which matches the portraiture that survives. For an ancient Greek, a 5th century Athenian looking at Socrates looks like a satyr. And a satyr is a comic character, right? It's like half goat, half man. They tend to run around chasing nymphs, getting drunk. Satyr dramas, like every time you went to the theater of Dionysia and watched the Dionysiac performances and you'd see 3 tragedies, you would, at the end of each one, there would be a satyr drama, and they all looked like Socrates, and they were all comic. So he was kind of swimming upstream in terms of living in a society where beauty, particularly physical beauty, is very much prized. However, he was also acknowledged as being quite physically tough. He saved Alcibiades' life in battle, and that's one of the highest military accomplishments you can reach, saving a citizen's life, because the whole basis of the army is based on having, oh my gosh, having citizens. All it takes is someone to move around. Actually, if you move there, that'll probably turn the lights on. Yeah, there it is. So if you haven't experienced it, you will experience it in the final exam. Everyone's standing still, everyone's busy writing, and the lights will go out. Anyway, so he was recognized that, and he was a stone cutter, which is physically demanding as well. Another thing about Socrates was, we talked about the military and about how important it is not to just turn around and run away. And Socrates was famous for retreating in what was described as a crab-like manner. He didn't go backwards. It was like giving up ground as little as possible, moving side to side. So he was acknowledged for his for attributes that were prized by the community. Anyway, wrote nothing, attracted a lot of young men who were kind of questioning the established order. And he started off with the principle, and he said he got this from the Delphic Oracle, because everything comes from the Delphic Oracle, that he knew nothing. He didn't claim to have the answers to life, the universe, and everything. He knew nothing. And his job was just to ask questions, to try to learn something. So he presented himself to people as, I don't know anything. You claim that you know something. So let me ask you some stuff so I can understand this better, because like you're a poet, so you understand poetry, you understand how inspiration works. So I want to try to understand that. And he would ask questions. But the thing is that through the probing of Socrates, all that he would find out was that this so-called, I hate to say that, so-called expert, but this expert turned out to actually not know as much as they knew. And so we would undermine that and start, well, I still don't know anything left, so I got to find someone else to bug. People don't like having their deeply held beliefs undermined like that, which is what made Socrates unpopular. Because he was also very much associated with the sophistic movement in Athens, which was a situation where, what's a really great skill to have if you're in the assembly and you're debating something?
Public speaking.
Totally. You want to be able to get up and just like physically bellow it out. Projection is good. But also the ability to, it's like, I think this is a good idea. I think this is what we should decide. So what's beneficial there?
Manipulating public opinion.
That's not cynical. Yes, the ability to convince people that you're right. So having good arguments, a lot of times the training for this was, and I must confess that I do this myself with my own daughters, is you want to understand what the other person's thinking. And so, okay, what's their logic? What are their arguments? Now I can think of good counter arguments to what they're thinking. So one of the exercises that you would have is, here is an issue. Make a speech in favor of it. Make a speech in favor of X. Make a speech in favor of Y. Make them both equally convincing. That was very disturbing for a lot of people, because it's like, okay, you have no morals or scruples whatsoever. You don't care about what side. You are making the best argument possible for the person who's wrong. And they used to think in terms of there's a right answer and a wrong answer. And you are making a really strong, powerful, convincing argument for the wrong answer. That is about as amoral as you can be, as far as I'm concerned, as a 5th century Athenian. Socrates was very much lumped into the sophists who were going around teaching people who wanted to be strategoi and wanted to influence public opinion. He actually didn't do that, but he was the most well-known person in terms of having followers, having people listening to him, and physically he stood out. He didn't look like the average citizen. So it was a bit of a lightning rod for something that he actually didn't even do. And as we've mentioned, we've talked about this already, after the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War, they wanted to blame someone. Got to have a scapegoat. They settled on Socrates. And as we've talked about, he defended himself, was convicted by a slim majority, got up, made a speech that was very self-defeating, and was sentenced to execution. Which, according to both accounts we have that survive, was something that he did not flee from at all. He accepted that as the will of the community. All right. Next up on the list, his very dear close follower, Plato. And it's funny, this is a fairly standard depiction of Plato. But if you think about Plato, when Socrates drank his hemlock, committed suicide, Plato was only 29. I'd love to see depictions of Plato at the age of 29 rather than the age of like 59. Anyway, wrote a ton. Wrote about government, wrote about Socrates, preserved at least his version of Socrates' conversations with individuals in the dialogues, which itself became a format for philosophical discussion. Was, rather than somebody just writing down a treatise on philosophy, it was the idea of presenting it as a dialogue, as a discussion between two individuals, which is a lot more. I mean, if you think it, this sounds weird. It's kind of like 4th century BC podcast. I don't know about you guys. I find a podcast is a lot more engaging if you've got two people bouncing stuff off each other in a conversation rather than one person droning on and on. Like me right now. I need to have someone else. Anyway, one of the things that he proposed was that there is a perfect version of everything. Human being, chair, whatever it is, there is a perfect version of it. And what we see around us are the imperfect imitations of that. We see beautiful things, but there is an object that is sort of beauty itself. And he also talked about the soul being something that was inside the body, but separate from it. And that the ideal state for the soul is to actually be freed from the body. And then finally, he talked about the philosopher king. The ideal person being somebody who doesn't want to be king. As soon as somebody wants to be king, they shouldn't be. And who is sort of ethically and intellectually superior to all the rest of us mere mortals. I suppose the closest we get in the ancient world was Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, but was also a philosopher, wrote philosophical treatises and that kind of stuff. If you take the Rome course, we might talk about whether he was successful. All right, then next up it's almost like a genealogy of philosophers, is Aristotle, who follows Plato. Student of Plato. By the way, Plato established his own sort of group. Hate to say school because it makes it sound like he's got a charter and he's got a building with classrooms and that kind of stuff. But he certainly had a physical space in a building that he lived in, and where people who wanted to talk philosophy with him and learn from him went to. Aristotle was one of his students, and he started his own place. And this was one that actually continued on for some time. Wrote about just about everything, and you can see that 31 out of 300 works survive. There's an entire murder mystery that is written on the basis of one of these books that didn't survive. If you can believe that. And it's the book, he wrote a book on tragedy, that survives. He wrote a book on comedy. That one didn't survive. So, and it's a really good book, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which is basic. And it's a movie that has Sean Connery in it as a monk. And it's quite good. And it's based upon the Aristotle's book, Treatise on Comedy, not surviving. And basically that somebody doesn't want it to survive. Anyway, he taught things like the logic of an argument was based on its structure rather than its content. He was very structural. So when he talked about the best ancient Athenian tragedy ever written, it's the Oedipus Rex. It's not necessarily that the content or the ideas being expressed, it is how it is structured. And how that structure contributes to the audience's appreciation and how it affects the audience. He was quite famous for being the tutor to Alexander the Great. We kind of don't really get a chance to see how Aristotle's teachings might have influenced Alexander's role as a leader, as a ruler, because he didn't really get much chance to rule. He conquered a massive territory and then died before we got a chance to see whether he would be able to manage and administrate that as well as he conquered it. But there's not very many times where you get to see two major figures in world history crossing like that. So it's kind of a neat one just for that. Philosophical framework and ideas were extremely influential on Christian thought for centuries. And in fact, you get a lot of Christian writing in the medieval period is working to synthesize Aristotle's philosophy and structuralism with Christ's moral teachings. As an example of Aristotle's influence, when Dante is writing the Divine Comedy in 1300 AD, so let's see, that's over 1600 years after Aristotle has died. That gives you an idea of influence there. He structures hell, purgatory, and heaven on an Aristotelian model, not on a biblical model, on an Aristotelian model. Whoops. And you probably just noticed now that I seem to have an interest in Dante. I think Divine Comedy is one of my favorite reads. Anyway, two more to talk about. they're not part of the genealogy of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. They're two separate philosophers that come along in the 3rd century BC, but they develop a philosophical school of thought that is pretty much dominates the ancient world, and it still influences us. The first one is Zeno of Citium, and you can see he's very much after Aristotle. Aristotle, this guy was just a boy when Aristotle died. That name probably means nothing to anyone, unless you're a hardcore. Well, I should say hardcore, unless you're a philosophy student. Does that name ring anybody's bell? I should think not.
Well,
That's why I don't give people a lot of shite when their phones go off, because a lot of times they say, oh, I forgot to mute it. Zeno of Citium taught in an area of Athens called the Stoa Poikile. And I don't know if anybody remembers, but that is where the Battle of Marathon was painted at. They had a depiction of the Battle of Marathon, the gods overseeing it. That sound familiar? So this is where this guy taught. He just taught in that covered area there. So it's outside. It's very casual. But he taught in the Stoa. I don't know if anybody's etymological brain is ticking over at all at this point. Yeah, in the Stoa. The Stoa particularly. Anyway, he started off as a cynic, but he became a Stoic. So there's where the term Stoic comes from, right? We tend to think of Stoic, somebody who just endures whatever without complaining at all. But Stoic comes from just an architectural feature in 5th century architecture of a covered walkway. Yeah. So Zeno develops a school of thought which eventually becomes known as Stoicism. It has 3 parts. It has logic, it has physics, sorry about that, and ethics. Basically, the aim, and we could talk forever about Stoicism, the aim of Stoicism is to live in harmony with nature using your logos, your reason. To live in harmony, and when I say nature, he's not particularly talking about like going into the woods and living a simple life like that. He's talking about living in harmony with the cosmos. So with existence. To live in harmony with the cosmos is good. Not to live in harmony is actually evil. Everything else is yeah, whatever. If something happens to you and it doesn't stop you from living in harmony with the cosmos, you don't care. It's irrelevant. The Romans particularly liked Stoicism. I mentioned Marcus Aurelius. He was a Stoic. Cicero was kind of a Stoic as well. It is the idea, they tended to particularly pick up on the physical side of this, of just not allowing physical hardships to bother you or distract you at all from what you're doing. There we go. Under the empire, particularly late 1st, 2nd century AD, a senator would express his opposition to the emperor through Stoicism. Often by, it's sort of like, it's almost like say, you're irrelevant. I totally disagree with you. This is wrong. And I'll eventually committing suicide to show how they were going to live in harmony with the cosmos. And if the emperor wasn't going to let them do that, they would commit suicide. The last one is kind of thought of as the opposite of Zeno, and that is Epicurus. That name might sound more familiar because this is it. They don't have Zenoism, but they do have Epicureanism. He taught actually in Lesbos. He's more in Ionia, that area, right? But he eventually moves to Athens. You can see that his time, his years almost exactly coincide with Stoicism. So these two major schools of thought developed pretty much simultaneously in the same city. Bought a house and then he lived and taught there. His philosophy was just the opposite. He taught that the cosmos was accidental. It was just, there was a rain of atoms coming down, and then one of them swerved and bumped into another, and then that caused this massive concatenation of collisions, and that's what made everything happen. Atoms came together, they would sometimes bounce off each other, they'd sometimes gather together, and then matter starts developing until you've got like a planet. So it is not created by the gods, and in fact the gods don't really care about what happens. He didn't say they don't exist, but he said they don't care. The ultimate purpose in life is pleasure, and then you get things like Epicurean delights, and we tend to think of Epicurean and hedonism as the same thing. Hedonism is just the headlong desire for pleasure. Epicureanism, it's pleasure, but pleasure is described as ataraxia. Ataraxia is the absence of disturbance or unpleasantness. So, for instance, a hedonist is going to go to a symposium, hammer down the wine, get drunk, have a great time, wake up with a hangover the next morning. Epicurus is like, no. You had a great time, but then in the morning, your ataraxia was totally screwed up. So that was not the right thing to do. You want to maintain this perfect state of Epicurean calm and lack of disturbance. And you best reach that ataraxia by studying philosophy. Notice how a lot of these guys are, the key to life is studying philosophy. Oh, by the way, I teach it. That's maybe being a little cynical, which is also philosophy. Anyway, the gods exist, but they don't care because the gods are perfect. And one way that they are perfect is they have reached the perfect state of ataraxia. Anything they might do, any action they might take, can only make them take a step down from perfection. Right? You almost can't do anything. You're trapped in perfection. If they were to get involved in human affairs, they start taking sides, that's going to screw up their ataraxia because things might not work out the way they want to. They're on, oh, darn, oh, my favorite lost, oh, my favorite died, whatever. So the gods watch human affairs from a great distance and take no part in them whatsoever because they've already reached that state of perfection and they ain't going anywhere from that. They don't want to mess it up. There is no afterlife, and therefore that should set us free from fear. We shouldn't be afraid of what's going to happen after because there is nothing there, so there's nothing there to be afraid of.
There's no consequence, there's no benefit.
Not so much consequence. It was just a matter of, it's just like live now. Don't think about what's going to happen afterwards. Because it's sort of like, it's just like a big sleep. The big, yes. Raymond Chandler. Anyway, so that was his talk. And this was the other major philosophical school that you got in Rome. In fact, most of the writers tended to be Epicureans. Those who weren't Stoics were Epicureans. You had some who liked both sides of it. And so they were eclectic, is what they get called. Anyway, last thing here. Now that we've talked about all this philosophy, does anybody know what the answer is to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? That's bad luck.
I was born on 13. 13's 11.
Anyway, meaning? No, it's 42. All right, we're done. That's Douglas Adams for you.